Hello. Today we are continuing the recording of Property and Capital, starting off from the same part as we were on last time, published in Prometeo 1950 in the first issue. Last time we had another segment from this part, which was just a note to the chapter from the previous part, which was a little bit confusing. But the rest of this part is basically summarizations or short theses that are related to all of the different chapters that we went through so far. It will have a small exposition of some of the chapters in the middle of the book that were never written, I believe. And then it will also give a little bit of an introductory summary to the chapters at the end of the book, which are there. So we start off with the note on the theses related to chapters 1 to 6. For the first chapter, Class Revolutions, we have, quote, "In social revolutions, a class takes away the power from the one which already held it whenever the collision between the old property relations and the new forces of production leads to the shattering of the former." For the second chapter, the Bourgeois Revolution, we have, quote, "The bourgeois revolution, when technical discoveries had imposed large-scale production and mechanized industry, abolished the privileges of the feudal proprietors over the personal work of serfs as well as the corporate constraints on manual labor, expropriated in large measure the artisans and small peasants, stripping them of their land, of their instruments of labor, and of the products of their labor, in order to transform them, like the serfs, into waged proletarians." For chapter 3, the Proletarian Revolution, we have, quote, "The class of wage labor struggles against the bourgeoisie to abolish, along with the private ownership of land and production facilities, the private ownership of the products of agriculture and industry, suppressing the forms of production by companies and commercial and monetary distribution." For chapter 4, the ownership of agrarian soil, we have, quote, "In place of the communal management of agricultural land and of its distribution in feudal constituencies, the bourgeois revolution established the free trade in land, making it like that of the industrial and commercial companies, a bourgeois possession acquired not by birth, but with money." And then for the note that was attached to this chapter on the alleged feudalism of the Mezzogiorno in Italy, quote, "The bourgeois order in agriculture, like everywhere else in Italy, is fully accomplished in the south. The alleged need for a struggle against the baronial and feudal privileges constitutes a total deviation from the struggle of the proletarian class against the regime and bourgeois state of Rome." For chapter 5, Bourgeois Property Law, we have, quote, "The legal discipline applied by the bourgeoisie to the purchase and possession of land, with feudal bonds abolished, was taken from Roman law, governing small peasant property and large bourgeois landed property with the same formal rules." And then for the note on the agrarian reform in Italy, we have, quote, "The problems of Italian agriculture are not soluble by legal reforms of the titular distribution of possessions, but only by the revolutionary struggle to overthrow the national power of the bourgeoisie, to eliminate the domination of capital over agriculture and the pulverization of the land, a miserable form of exploitation of those who work on it." Then for chapter 6, Urban Property, we have, quote, "The property of the soil and of urban buildings has been subjected to market discipline and private ownership in the capitalist period. The concentration of the poor into cramped spaces is a condition of capitalist accumulation. The expensiveness and lack of housing and the excessive crowding therein are a characteristic of the bourgeois epoch. The attribution of housing as property to the single tenant, the suppression or reduction of rent, or even the nationalization of the land and buildings does not constitute a program corresponding to the interests of the working class. The proletarian revolution will immediately begin a new redistribution of housing for use, with the subsequent aim of decongesting the large urban centers via a fundamental overturn of relationship between city and country." And then we have something for the note on the Italian housing question. The policy of freezing rents and plans to remedy employment by building housing are reformist abortions and demagogic resources of a beaten and vassal bourgeoisie such as the Italian bourgeoisie. They confirm the subjection of the public administration to capitalism and to its speculative requirements, and the absurdity of the implementation of rational planning with mercantile economies based on the profit of the enterprise. And that was it for the chapters that we went through so far. But then after this we have the summary of chapters that were not yet published. Starting with chapter 7, the ownership of movable property. Movable goods, which are provided through production and are not the object of titular ownership and are usable or exchangeable at the will of their possessor, such is the legal formulation in bourgeois society. In essence, with mass production, the capitalist entrepreneur has possession and disposition of all movable things, products, and commodities resulting from the work in his enterprise. The socialist demand to abolish the class monopoly of entrepreneurial capitalists over the means of production, presented as the abolition of titular private ownership over business premises and facilities, has the real scope of abolishing the monopoly of individual entrepreneurs and the capitalist class over the masses of products. Any measure which, by limiting the rights of the owner of the workplace, plant, or machinery, preserves the direct or indirect monopoly of persons or firms or the class of capitalists over products and their destination and distribution, is not socialism. Then we have Chapter 8, Industrial Enterprise. The capitalist production company has as its owner an entrepreneur who may be an individual or a legal person, firm, company, corporation, joint stock company, cooperative, etc. Even in cases where the firm has fixed premises and facilities, the real estate or even the machinery and equipment may belong to an owner other than the entrepreneur. In classical bourgeois economics, the exchange value of each commodity is measured in human labor time, but it is argued that there is the same market and legal equilibrium in the buying and selling of goods and in the remuneration of labor performed by the firm's employees. Profit would reward the superior technical organization of the various factors. Marx showed with the doctrine of surplus value that the wage or price paid for labor power is less than the value it adds to the commodity when all value is expressed by labor time. The profit on capital represents the unpaid labor of workers. Modern production technology, which requires the substitution of social for individual activity, is imprisoned in the forms of private enterprise in order to guarantee the extortion of surplus value. The industrial class that takes advantage of it preserves and defends, thanks to the political power it holds, the system of production that ensures maximum profit and accumulation, while the socially useful and beneficial products, both available to the working class and to all classes, are compressed to a minimum in relation to the enormous mass of labor efforts. The excess and wastage of the social labor of the proletarian class relative to the mass of useful consumer products gives a passive ratio tens of times worse than the ratio of unpaid work to paid work, or the surplus value ratio for the individual wage earner. The following theses are therefore inadequate. Socialism consists in the payment of the full fruit of their industry, with the abolition of surplus labor and surplus value. The exploitation of wage earners would be abolished. Any economy without surplus value is a socialist economy. A socialist economy can be accounted for in figures of money. A socialist economy consists in the accounting of labor time. Socialism is the social and historical elimination of capitalism, the system of production driven by the initiative of enterprises or the federation of enterprises constituted by the bourgeois class and state. Even before the higher stage, in which each will levy according to its need, a socialist economy and accounting can be said to have been achieved only in those sectors in which double-entry accountancy and corporate balance sheets will not appear, and only physical units of measurement, such as the units of weight, capacity, force, and mechanical energy, will be used in organizational forecasting calculations. Now we are on to Chapter 9, Associations between Enterprises and Monopolies. The fundamental position of bourgeois economics is that the selection of the most socially useful enterprises is ensured by free market phenomena and the equilibrium of prices according to the supply of and demand for products. Marxism showed that even if we accept this bourgeois fiction and petty bourgeois illusion of the economics of free competition, production and exchange for a moment, the laws of accumulation and concentration operating within it lead to frightening crises of overproduction, destruction of products and labor forces, abandonment of productive plants, unemployment, and widespread misery. It is through the waves of such crises that the antagonism between the rich and powerful capitalist class and the misery of the employed and unemployed masses is sharpened, driven to organize as a class and rise in revolt against the system that oppresses them. The bourgeoisie, the ruling class, first found sufficient basis for its unity in the political and administrative state, its committee of interests, despite the pretense of elective institutions in which it ruled through these parties, which, as revolutionary oppositions, had led the anti-feudal revolution. The force of this power was immediately directed against the first manifestation of workers' class pressure. The organization of the workers into economic trade union moves within the limits of the struggle to reduce the rate of surplus value. The further organization into political parties expresses their ability to set themselves as a class the goal of overthrowing the power of the bourgeoisie, of suppressing capitalism with the radical reduction of the quantity of labor, the increase of consumption, and general welfare. For its part, the antagonistic bourgeois class, unable to stop the acceleration of capital accumulation, managed to cope with the enormous dispersion of productive forces and consequences of periodic crises, the effects of workers' organization, by adopting at a certain point of development the forms, known from the very history of primitive accumulation, of understandings, agreements, associations, and alliances between entrepreneurs. These at first were limited to market relations, both in the placement of products and in the purchase of labor, with commitments to comply with given indices by avoiding competition. Then they extended to the whole productive machinery monopolies, trusts, cartels, syndicates of enterprises making similar products horizontal or providing for successive transformations leading to given products vertical. The description of such passage of capitalism as a confirmation of the rightness of Marxism, which proved that free competition gives rise to the concentration of production, which in turn at a certain stage of development leads to monopoly, is classic in Lenin's book on Imperialism. Now we have chapter 10, Finance Capital. The entrepreneur needs, in addition to the factory and machines, liquid monetary capital which he advances to buy raw materials and pay wages and eventually gets back by selling products. As with the factory and plants, he may not own this capital as well. Unless the entrepreneur or the enterprise loses ownership of the business, protected by law, he has such capital provided by banks against an annual rate of interest. The bourgeois, having reached his ideal form, now reveals himself to be naked and without real estate or movable property, without money, and above all without scruples. He no longer invests and risks anything of his own, but the mass of products legally remains in his hands and hence the profit. He has rid himself of property, gaining many other advantages. It is his strategic position that needs to be wrestled from him. It is a social, historical, and legal position, which only falls with the political revolution, the premise for the economic revolution. The bourgeois class, through the apparent separation of industrial and financial capital, actually tightens its bonds. The dominance of financial operations causes the big corporations to control the small ones, and minor companies eventually to swallow them up in a national and international arena. The final oligarchy, which concentrates immense capital in a few hands and exports and invests it from one country to another, is an integral part of the entrepreneurial class itself, the center of whose activity increasingly shifts from productive technique to business maneuvering. On the other hand, under the joint stock company system, the capital of the industrial enterprise, consisting of real estate, tools, and cash, is titularly owned by the stockholders, who take the place of any real estate owner, machine lessor, or anticipatory bank. Lease and rental fees and interest from advances take the form of an always modest profit or dividend distributed to shareholders by the management, the enterprise. This is an entity in its own right which brings share capital to its balance sheet liabilities and plunders its creditors by various maneuvers, the true central form of accumulation. The banking maneuver, in turn, with share capital, performs this service of plundering the small holders of money on behalf of industrial and business groups. The production of ultra profits magnifies as we move away from the figure of the industrial boss, whose technical expertise brought socially useful innovations. Capitalism becomes more and more parasitic, that is, instead of earning and accumulating little by producing a lot and enabling a lot of people to consume, it earns and accumulates enormously by producing little and satisfying social consumption poorly. Then we have chapter 11, Capital and Imperialist Politics. In the more industrially advanced countries, the entrepreneur class finds limits to the investment of accumulated capital set either by the shortage of local raw materials or by that of metropolitan labor, or by that of consumer markets. The conquest of foreign markets, the hiring of foreign workers, the import of raw materials, or finally the operation of the whole capitalist enterprise in a foreign country with local elements and factors, are processes that cannot in the capitalist world be carried out by pure economic means, such as the game of competition. They imply the attempt to regulate and control selling and buying prices, and hand over privileges and protections with state measures or interstate conventions. Thus, economic expansionism becomes open or digested colonialism, backed by mighty military means. It is force that decides rivalries for the grabbing of colonies and domination over small and weak states, whether to control the great mineral deposits, the masses to be proletarianized, or the strata of consumers capable of absorbing the products of capitalist industrialism. The latter are, in the modern world, however, largely made up not only of the proletarian and capitalist consumers of the advanced countries, but also of the middle classes, such as the agrarian and artisan classes, and of the populations of countries with economies that are not yet capitalist, forming today, like so many islands that successively emerge from a local and autarkic economic cycle, and are as if immersed in and surrounded by the general fabric of the international capitalist economy. In this is the difficult general framework of the reproduction and accumulation of capital, crises of overproduction, and the saturation of possibilities of placing products throughout the world on the basis of mercantile and monetary distribution. It is evident to any Marxist that the complication of such a historical relationship between supra-industrial metropolises and backwards countries, of white race and other races, can only generate incessant conflicts, not only between colonizers and colonized, but especially between groups of conquesting states. Proletarian theory rejects the following theses as counter-revolutionary. A. That we can and must curb the diffusion of industrial technology and large organized networks of communication and transportation in the world, residual liberalism and petty bourgeois liberalism, and B, that it is necessary to support the colonial and imperial enterprises of the bourgeois socially and politically. This is social democratic opportunism, the corruption of labor leaders and a proletarian aristocracy. Or C, that the colonial system based on capitalism can lead to an economic and political balance among the imperialist powers, or to a stable single imperial center, and avoid the progressive arms race and militarism and the strengthening of oppressive and repressive systems of class policing, false internationalism and federalism among bourgeois states based on the simulated autonomy and self-determination of peoples and systems of security and prevention of quote-unquote aggression. We quote from Lenin, "Imperialism is the epoch of finance capital and of monopolies which introduce everywhere the striving for domination, not for freedom." And then another quote, "Therefore, in the realities of the capitalist system, inter-imperialist, whether though of one imperialist coalition against another or of a general alliance embracing all the imperialist powers, are inevitably nothing more than a truce in periods between wars. The only way out of world imperialism is a world revolution." Now we go on to chapter 12, which goes by the name The Modern Enterprise, Without Property and Without Finance, Contracts and Concessions. Every new social form, which because of the development of productive forces tends to become generalized, first appears among the traditional forms with examples and models of the new approach. Today we can study the form of the propertyless enterprise by analyzing the construction industry and more generally public works, whose relative weight in the economy tends to increase more and more. It is convenient to eliminate the figure of the client, the owner of the land or buildings on which work is being done, and who will become the owner of the completed project, regardless of whether it is a private individual, an entity, or the state, for the purposes of the economic dynamics of the general contractor. The enterprise or contractor of the works has these characteristics. 1. This contractor doesn't have its own workshop, factory, or establishment, but on each occasion sets up the construction site and offices on premises made available by the client, which even charges itself an amount for such planned construction sites and temporary constructions in accounting terms. It may have tools or even its own machines, but more often, moving to disparate and distant locations, it either rents them or buys and resells them on the spot, or manages to charge for their full depreciation. Finally, it must in theory have a liquid capital to advance for new raw materials and wages, but it should be noted, A, that it obtains this easily from the banks when it proves that it has been awarded good work by pledging the contracts, B, that in modern forms the state often finances, advances, or obliges credit institutions to do so by means of special laws, and C, that the unit prices on the basis of which the enterprise is paid for units of work, i.e. the real products of the industry in question, placed and priced at the outset and without any commercial risk, while it is eventually very easy to achieve increases in accounts, these are formed by also adding to all expenses an amount for interest on the capital advanced, and only after all this the profit of the contractor. So in this typical form there subsists enterprise, surplus value, and profit, which is generally very high, while all ownership of real estate, movable tools, and even cash from the perspective of that contractor disappears. When all of these relationships are handled by public bodies of the state, capitalism breathes the best oxygen, the rates of remuneration reach the maximum, and the overspending falls indirectly on the other classes, to a small extent on the property owners and smallholders, and to a large extent on the poor and proletarian classes. In fact, the company does not pay a land tax because it has no real estate, and taxes on the movable assets are also reimbursed to it in the unit price analysis by including them in the overhead item. And just as a personal note to add to this, today our tax system is very, very different, but it is very much still the case today that firms of a leaner kind can do a lot more maneuvering around their taxes in very complex ways that, of course, I don't want to get into here. Anyway, let's go on. In these ways, the entrepreneurial class pays nothing to maintain the state. Similar to the contract is the concession. The concessionaire receives an area, a building, sometimes a complete facility, from the public body. He operates it and makes his own products and earnings. He's obliged to carry out further works, installations, or improvements and pays a certain fee in money, either at once or in periodic installments. After a certain number of years, which is always considerable, all the property, including the new works and transformations, will revert to the granting estate or public body in whose name it has always remained. The economic calculation regarding such a relationship demonstrates its enormous benefit to the manager, where one well considers the real estate taxes he does not pay, the substantial interest or annuity that accrues to the value of the original land and installations, which he did not have to purchase, the depreciation payments to compensate for wear and tear and aging, which he does not have to set aside, because he will hand back installations that are not new but used and exploited for a long time. The concession implies an almost total absence of risk on the concessionaire's own investment, the same high profit as contracting, and the important feature of being able to extend to all types of production and supply of industries, even with a fixed location. This tendency, in this form, can thus cover all economic sectors while retaining the principle of enterprise and profit. The modern state never actually engages in direct economic activity, but rather activity that is always delegated by contracts and concessions to capitalist groups. This is not a process by which capitalism and the bourgeois class are pushed back from positions of privilege. The apparent abandonment of such positions is matched by an increase in the mass of surplus value, profit, and accumulation, and in the excess power of capital and for all that social antagonisms. The mass of accumulated industrial and financial capital at the disposal of the entrepreneurial maneuvering of the bourgeois class is thus much greater than it appears by adding up the individual holdings, both of movable and immovable values, titled to the individual capitalists and owners, and this is expressed by Marx's fundamental theorem, which describes the capitalist system as a fact and as a social production ever since it asserted itself under the armor of personal law. Capitalism is a class monopoly, and all capital accumulates more and more as the endowment of a ruling class, and not as that of many individuals and firms. Having introduced this principle, Marx's schemes and equations on the reproduction, accumulation, and circulation of capital cease to be mysterious and incomprehensible. Now we go into chapter 13. Interventionism and economic dirigism as management of the state by capital. The ensemble of countless modern actions by which the state apparently disciplines events and activities of economic nature in production, exchange, and consumption is wrongly considered as a reduction and a control of the capitalist characters of present society. The doctrine of the abstention of the state from assuming economic functions and implementing interventions in the production and circulation of goods is but an ideological mask suited to the period when capitalism had to make its way as a revolutionary force, breaking through the circle of all social and legal obstacles that prevented it from unfolding its productive potential. For Marxism, the bourgeois state, even as soon as it is formed, by guaranteeing the appropriation of goods and products by those disposing of accumulated money, by codifying the right of individual property and its protection, exercises an openly economic function, and does not merely witness from the outside a supposed natural spontaneity of the phenomena of the private economy. In this is the whole history of primitive accumulation, the cradle of modern capitalism. As the capitalist type of organization invades the social fabric and world territories and rouses, with the concentration of wealth and the despoliation of the middle classes, the modern class contradictions and contrasts, raising against itself the proletarian class, formerly its ally in the anti-feudal struggle, the bourgeoisie increasingly transforms the class bond between its elements from a vaunted pure ideological, philosophical, and legal solidarity into a unity of organization for the control of the course of social relations, and does not hesitate openly to admit that these arise not from opinions but from material interests. The state then takes to the productive field and the economic field in general, always by the class thrust, and aims of the capitalists, undertakers of economic activities and initiators of increasingly broad-based businesses. Every socio-economic measure of the state, even when it goes so far as to effectively impose prices of foodstuffs or commodities, wage levels, charges to the employer for social security, etc., responds to a mechanism in which capital acts as the engine and the state as the operating machine. For example, the contractor of a public work, or the concessionaire, say, of a railroad or electric network, is ready to pay higher wages and social security contributions, since the same are automatically factored into the calculation of unit prices or public tariffs. Profit, being valued as the percentage of the total, grows. Surplus value grows as mass and grows as rate, since wage earners also pay state taxes and use railways and electricity, and the wage index always lags behind others. The system also increasingly encourages companies whose products and services serve little or no purpose or foster more or less antisocial and malign consumption, fomenting an irrationality and anarchy of production, as opposed to the vulgar notion that sees in the system of a principle of scientific ordering and a victory for the famous general interests. It is not a question of partial subordination of capital to the state, but further subordination of the state to capital. And as greater subordination of the individual capitalists to the capitalists as a whole takes place, there follows greater strength and power of the ruling class, and greater subjection of the small capitalists to the greatly privileged. Economic direction by the state responds more or less effectively in various times and places with waves of advances and returns to the multiple class needs of the bourgeoisie, averting or overcoming crises of under and overproduction, preventing and suppressing the rebellions of the exploited classes, coping with the frightening socioeconomic effects of wars of expansion, conquest, the struggle for world dominance, and the profound upheaval of the periods that follow them. Proletarian theory does not see state interventionism as an anticipation of socialism, justifying political support for bourgeois reformers, and slowing down the class struggle. It considers the political economic bourgeois state as a more developed, aggressive, and ferocious enemy than the abstract, purely legal state, and pursues its destruction. But it does not oppose this expected modern development of capitalism with liberal or free trade demands or hybrid theories based on the virtue of production units autonomous from central systematic connections and linked in exchange by free contractual agreements. This is the syndicalism, the economics of the factory committees. Alright, so that was it for the summaries of the various unpublished chapters, which I haven't been able to find so far. If I find them, you will see them. They will be included in the full PDF. Now we move on to the last chapter of this kind of irregular part 6, and this is just a collection of notes, of summaries of the various chapters that are about to come. There's only 4 left. Let's just go through them. 14. State capitalism. Ownership of the land, of plants, and money in the state form is accumulated at the disposal of private capitalist production or business enterprises and their initiative. Then 15. Phases of economic transformation in Russia after 1917. predominance in the present Russian economy of the capitalist character due to the partly disguised existence of domestic and foreign enterprises moving in the mercantile and monetary environment. Now we have chapter 16, the formation of the communist economy. The characteristics of the new system of production and distribution can be given as a dialectical opposition to the obstacles preventing its development. Investigation of anticipated partial manifestations of activity in non-capitalist forms. Then we have chapter 17, the last one, Utopia, Science, Action. The revolutionary proletarian movement possesses the positive theory of the social unfolding and conditions of the communist revolution. The preservation of the right line depends on the continuity, coherence, and straightness of the course of action. This movement can only be led by an organization in which a minority of the class in struggle is represented. And this is the end of part 6. Whoopity-doo!